Thank you. Welcome to the second plenary session. I'm Jae-Ho Chung of Seoul National University. I'll be moderating this session for the next 90 minutes. We have a stellar list of panelists for this session. Since you all have the bio in the program, so I won't get into the detailed introduction of each speaker. I'll just briefly introduce each of the 5 speakers. To my left, Ambassador Dino Djalal, who is the founder of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, as well as the former ambassador to the United States. Next to him is Professor Aaron Friedberg, professor at Princeton University, as well as a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asia Research. Next is Professor François Godement, who is the director of the Asia and China programs at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Next is Professor Hugh White, who is the professor at the Australian National University. And next to him is Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz, who is now at the American Enterprise Institute, but formerly the president of World Bank, as well as the Deputy Secretary of Defense. This is how I'm going to spend 90 minutes for this session. I will spend a few minutes on contextualizing this issue for the session in relation to the theme of the conference. And then I'll ask each of the speakers to speak for 7 minutes. And then on the basis of their presentations, I will pose questions to each of the 5 speakers. And then we'll have some exchanges among us. And then I'll use the last 10 minutes for a floor discussion. To me, we are living in an era of crisis. I think that crisis has several components. I think one, the rise of illiberal and neo-rightist forces within many states. Second, the rise of, or the return of nation states, which leads to the Brexit or the decline of the World Trade Organizations, the collapse of the Paris Accord on climate change, and so on and so forth. Third, there also seems to be a trend toward a more closed, inclusive regionalism at the expense of an open, inclusive regionalism. There is also a problem of securitization, if not over-securitization of trade, investment, tourism, and currency. So overall, I think there seems to be a transition from the power of rules to the rule of power. And at the heart of all these crises and problems lies the clash of the 2 titans. The United States now proposes to place America first and to make America great again. China is now proposing to materialize the China dream and the revival of the great Chinese nation. So basically, US wants to prevent a peer competitor from rising, and China wants to democratize the international order. When you come to think of it, it is often puzzling, because back in 1872, that's the year when the GDP of the United States surpassed that of the UK, and that was known to many at the time. But the real power transition between the US and UK had to wait for 72 years until 1944, when the Bretton Woods system was created to buttress the rise of a new hegemon that was the United States. This is 2018. The GDP of China has not yet even surpassed that of the United States in nominal terms. But we are already talking a lot about the prospect of hegemonic competition, hegemonic war. I don't have to mention about the famous book by Professor Allison and so on and so forth. There seems to be a shadow of history, because China was an empire on many occasions, Tang, Ming, Qing, if we exclude Yuan. So people seem to think China is on the verge of becoming another empire soon, and probably in a destined way. Okay? Probably after 2010, when China surpassed Japan in GDP terms, people began to think China will not remain as a middle power, but will become a hegemonic competitor. And after 2013, the debate in the academic and policy communities about whether or not China has really become assertive again has disappeared. Nobody really now seems to be arguing about that issue. So, and also at the same time, America is now being perceived increasingly as not representing the liberal order. So people are confused. Many states in this region and beyond are confused what to support, what to rely on. And I think given the nuclear strategic balance between the US and China, these two powers will not enter into a total war. At the same time, China doesn't have an ally yet. So unlike the Cold War era, US and China cannot enter into proxy war either. So the only remaining option is the proxy competition. That means the US and China come to the region, ask regional states the exclusivity question, that is, are you with us or against us? That has happened so many times in the last 4 or 5 years over TPP, RCEP, AIIB, CICA, the South China Sea issue, in the case of South Korea, the deployment of THAAD, and so on and so forth. So this is really a dilemma, not only for the region, but also beyond. So against these backdrops, I would like to invite 5 speakers to give us their take on US-China relations. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. We are focusing in this session on China and the United States. And I think this is important because if you ask many countries around the world, especially around the region, what are the 2 most consequential nations to you? I think the answer would be United States and China. I mean, sorry Japan, sorry South Korea, sorry India, but realistically, the countries which will have the most impact across the board will be the United States and China. So let me begin with the prediction or the thing that I tell my young children about their future. I tell them that you have to get ready back to a 2 superpower world. I was born in a world of 2 superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union. In the last 18 years or so, I lived in we all live in one superpower world. And I think in several decades, that 2 superpower world will become a reality again. Right now, we live in a 1.5 superpower world, because even the Chinese say, hey, don't call us a superpower. Right? But out of Japan, South Korea, India, Russia, China is the only one with a trajectory and an ambition to become a superpower. Right now, Chinese strategic projection is only around the region and mostly as far away as Djibouti. But give them a couple decades and this will change to become more global. So 2 superpower world in the coming decades, now 1.5 superpower. But what is different this time is that the competition between US and China is not about ideology. Right? The Chinese have made it clear they don't want to export their ideology. In fact, they're as capitalists as many of us in this room. There are more millionaires and billionaires in China than in the United States. And it's not about nuclear annihilation. The competition is really about influence. It's about how China or United States can get as many countries to have a strategic orientation towards them. Both China and the United States want to become or to remain the most consequential nations to more and more countries in this region and in the world. So the competition is not about ideology, it's about access and influence. And to be honest, for countries like Indonesia, this is not so bad, because the way we see it, the more countries, United States, China, Japan, South Korea, and others, compete for influence and cooperation, so long it's non-strategic, the better for us. The more United States want to become the biggest investor, and then China says, no, we can top you, and then Japan says, no, we can even do better, this is all good for countries around the region. It's only when this takes the form of a zero-sum strategic competition, I win, you lose, that this becomes problematic for the region. And in this competition between US and China, I think what we need to watch for is the growing sense of Chinese exceptionalism. We hear a lot about American exceptionalism, but what we see is that the Chinese are becoming more confident. They see that historical developments have justified their thinking. When I visited China most recently, I see the enormous sense, not just of pride, but of justification of the policies they made and how they are destined to become a greater power, despite the humble words that they speak. And in this context, I do predict that the Chinese will use more economic means to advance their strategic influence. This is something that I've used in Southeast Asia for quite some time. In fact, if you ask me what is the most important geopolitical development in Southeast Asia in the last 2 decades or so, it's definitely Chinese engagement in the region of Southeast Asia. The next point is in this competition between US and China, I do see China gaining edge over the United States on diplomatic and political capital. My institute, working with Perth US Asia Center, we did a survey in Indonesia and other countries, including India, South Korea, and a few others, and Australia as well. And we asked the respondents, the public, what country is the most important in Asia? And what country is the most important in Asia in the next 10 years? And surprisingly, you know, the answer in the last 10 years or so has always been the United States, right? But this year, the public responded, it is not United States, it is China that is the most important country in Asia. And in the next 10 years, it will remain China as the most important countries in Asia. But keep in mind, they're not saying this in a necessarily positive way, right? They're not saying this is great for the region, but they are just acknowledging that China is more important than the US, with their positive and negative, with their comfort and discomfort. The next point is this. Look, the messaging now matters a lot more, right? And I'll be honest with you, the America First strategy is not an attractive concept to sell to Asians, right? I say this respectfully, but how do you go around the world and to our region and say, hey, follow us, but this is all about me, right? You come second, right? Even if the message is, hey, follow us and it's all about me, and you're on your own too, and you should fight your own interests, that's definitely still not a good message. You know, I joined international relations because you know, there's an idealism about saving the world. If I believe that every country is saying that, hey, it's all about us, right? I wouldn't be joining international relations. So it's really not a good concept to sell. And I understand when Vice President Mike Pence came to my country, and then the Defense Secretary, John Mattis, also came, they downplayed that America First message, and wisely so. But the Chinese message of common destiny, the Belt and Road, and togetherness, win-win, a new type of relation sounded more sober and more responsible and more mature. Yeah? That is the reality. Right now, President Trump, in the eyes of at least people in my country, seem a bit like a cocky statesman, right? And whereas President Xi Jinping seems to be more steady, right? And I tell you, there's a factor of Jerusalem as well. The decision on Jerusalem made it much more politically difficult for my president, President Jokowi, to politically embrace the United States at this time, because it's election time, this is Islamic electorate, and next year there's presidential election time. So that is the reality, but I should say that a lot of Southeast Asian countries, they don't feel too comfortable being too close to China, right? Putting all their bets on China. Their gut instinct says that they want to be close to the United States as well, because that is the best way to balance their relations with China. But the United States has to come up with a better concept than America First in order to engage countries in the region. The other thing I want to say that is I noticed that China has also promoted political party relations in their attempt to penetrate politically more in the countries around the region. So the Chinese Communist Party has established really active approach to Indonesian political parties as well as other Southeast Asian and Asian political parties. I think we noticed the visit of Kim Jong-un to Beijing was noted as a visit of a head of political party with the head of the Chinese political party. So that is one dimension that I find quite interesting and rather new, how China is using not just the government and diplomatic machineries, but the approach of political parties to extend their influence. And also when we talk about China, we talk about the difference in the policies within regions. So within the Southeast Asian region, you would have different policies of Cambodia towards China, Philippines towards China, and Indonesia towards China, for example. But what you need to be more aware is that it's not just differences in the policies within regions, but also within countries that are interesting to note. In Indonesia, for example, you note the difference between the policies of the leadership towards China and the policies of the bureaucracy towards China, the policies of the military and security sector towards China, and the perception of the public towards China. The perception towards public is much more restless, worrying for a number of reasons, rightly or wrongly, than the policies at the different layers of the nation. And I think that is worth taking note, and I think this is also happening in other countries. Two last points. One is, look, I think there is, I know we talk about strategic trust all the time in this kind of forums, right? But, you know, I'm from Southeast Asia, and I come to Northeast Asia. The one thing I notice about Northeast Asia is really there's a lot of historical baggage, you know? I was just in North Korea, you know, 3 weeks ago, right? And I asked them, you know, what is the country that you have historical resentment against the most? And the answer was Japan, yeah, and the United States. And I think if you go to South Korea, China, or Japan, you know, you see how historical mishaps in the past still shape strategic perspectives today. This is in contrast with Southeast Asia. My generation and my father's generation really got rid of these historical baggages, and we very much look forward in our thinking. So, I'm just wondering if we could, Northeast Asian countries can find a way to emulate the pragmatism and the sense of forward-looking of Southeast Asian countries. And not only that, look, Indonesia had confrontasi with Malaysia. We had war with Malaysia, with Singapore also. Indonesia had really serious problems, violent problems with East Timor, right? But with East Timor, over 2 years, it was erased. With Malaysia, over 1 year or 2 years after confrontasi, it was all erased. And now we become an Asian ASEAN family. And the last point is on stereotypes.
Quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. As you said, I was ambassador to the United States. I grew up in the United States. And I noticed, and now I'm the head of China policy group in Indonesia, but I noticed there's persistent stereotypes in America towards China and in China towards America, right? And these stereotypes are hard to get rid of, right? But I think the challenge of getting US-China relations on more stable footing, especially if we are going to anticipate a two-superpower world, is really to begin to undo and attack and remedy these stereotypes about one another. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Professor Friedberg, 7 minutes, hopefully.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be on this panel. I think it's probably not a controversial thing to say that relations between the United States and China have reached something of an inflection point. It seems to me likely that going forward, there is going to be, for some period of time, more intense and open competition between the two countries across all domains. And so what I wanted to do with my time was to say a little bit about how I think we got here and where we may be going. For 2 decades or so after the end of the Cold War, both the United States and China had more or less stable strategies for dealing with one another. And I think that reflected the belief on both sides that time was on their side. On the part of the United States, strategy towards China was part of a larger post-Cold War strategy that the Clinton administration referred to as enlargement, trying to enlarge the liberal democratic system that had been built in the West during the Cold War to include the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and parts of the former Soviet Empire, and also to accelerate the integration of China into that order as well. And regarding China in particular, US policy beginning, I think, in the early 1990s and continuing through both Republican and Democratic administrations, included 2 elements. On the one hand, an attempt to engage China, and this, of course, a continuation of policies that began with the Nixon-Kissinger openings in the late 60s and early 70s, and began to pick up in the economic domain after the beginning of reform and opening up in China in the late 70s and early 80s, but engaging China across the board, diplomatically, economically, cultural, scientific, education exchange and cooperation, and so on. But at the same time, certainly from, I would say, the mid-90s onwards, an effort to maintain a balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region that was favorable to the United States and its allies, and that included maintaining and strengthening traditional alliance relationships with Korea, with Japan, and others in the region, maintaining and strengthening US military capabilities in the region, and also beginning to develop quasi-alliance partnerships with other countries to whom the United States didn't extend security guarantees, but who shared with it to some extent a concern of the implications for their autonomy and security of China's growing power, including at one end of the spectrum a very small but influential country, Singapore, and then increasingly a large country at the other end, India. So a mix of engagement on the one hand and balancing on the other. And that mixed strategy, I think, has had 3 objectives. First, to try to welcome and incorporate China into the existing international system. As the Bush administration, the term of art in the Bush administration was to encourage China to become a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order, essentially a status quo power, to cause its leaders to see their interests as lying in the maintenance and strengthening of that order rather than in trying to change it or still less to overthrow it. That's number 1. Number 2, I think the hope was that as China became more fully engaged economically, particularly after it entered into the World Trade Organization in 2001, that a process of economic liberalization, which was already underway, would accelerate and be carried forward, and China's economic policies would come increasingly to resemble those of other advanced industrial countries. And last but not least, something which American leaders at least talked more openly about in the 1990s and maybe down to the early 2000s than they have more recently, I do think there's been a persistent belief and hope that eventually this process of integration and engagement would set in motion or encourage processes in China that would lead eventually to political reform, to liberalization. Looking at the Chinese side of this equation, on the other hand, China's post-Cold War strategy for dealing with the United States grows out of the experience of the late 80s and early 90s, so the Tiananmen Square incident and the subsequent sanctioning of China and its isolation, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And the strategy adopted at that point was consistent with Deng Xiaoping's famous hide and bide admonition, and Chinese leaders sought to avoid confrontation for the most part, particularly with the large powers and especially with the United States, to build up all the elements of their so-called comprehensive national power, economic, technological, military, and to advance incrementally towards their goals. I think for the most part, they saw themselves as being on the defensive strategically in relation to the United States, but that didn't mean that they could or should remain passive. Sought to strengthen their position in the region and where they could to weaken the foundations of the American position in the long run. And this strategy, too, I think had three objectives. First and foremost, to maintain the monopoly on political power of the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's always been the most important strategic objective of China's leaders. It governs everything they do, both domestically and internationally. Second, to move towards reestablishing China as the preponderant power in East Asia. There may have been differences among Chinese leaders about the timeline for achieving that goal, and perhaps also about the definition, what exactly it meant, but I think that was the consensus objective. And in the background, in the distance, the possibility that eventually China would be able to emerge as a global power on par with the United States. I think the process of change, the escalation in the competition that we've seen, begins with changes in Chinese strategy, which I would say date to 2008 and the global financial crisis. I think there's some evidence of it before, but it really becomes more obvious after that, and which have been intensified and institutionalized since late 2012, 2013, and the rise to power of Xi Jinping. And China's strategy, I think, in certain respects is not radically different than it's been. It's driven by the same factors, which I think are a mix of ambition on the one hand and insecurity on the other. A belief, particularly after the financial crisis, that American power was in decline and more rapidly than perhaps Chinese analysts had expected, and that China therefore had an opportunity to step up and assert its interests and expand its influence more rapidly than had previously been hoped. But at the same time, an underlying concern and fear, serious danger of unrest and instability, especially as economic growth slows, which is something that China's leaders have been expecting for a while. I think the financial crisis, in a way, was a near-death experience. They steered around its worst consequences by stimulating the economy, but I think the specter of economic stagnation has haunted China's leaders since then. And a belief also that the United States was preoccupied and divided, and that there was a moment, an opportunity for China to push forward and take advantage of that preoccupation. I think that was present back in 2008. I think it's a part of what's going on now with the changes in American domestic politics. In the last decade, and I would say especially in the last 5 years, there's been an increasing recognition, I think, in the United States that this existing strategy has failed, at least failed thus far, to achieve its objectives. And Xi Jinping's rule has driven this home, although again, I think there was evidence to suggest this even earlier. Obviously, China has not liberalized politically. In fact, it's become more repressive, in some respects more repressive than at any time since the Cultural Revolution. It has not continued on a steady path towards opening and reforming its economy. Indeed, in certain respects, it's redoubled and expanded its reliance on state-driven mercantilist economic policies. And increasingly, in its external behavior, I think it's become difficult to argue that China is becoming a satisfied status quo power. Indeed, to the contrary, it's behaving more like a revisionist power, wants to change important aspects of the existing arrangements, certainly in this part of the world, and I think also increasingly beginning to express a desire to do that at a global level as well. So the question has been how to respond, and I think there was a debate in the United States that had begun a few years ago, and it was coming, and I think change was coming even without the election of Donald Trump. I think if you go back and imagine if Mrs. Clinton had been elected or one of the more mainstream Republicans had been elected, I think there would have been shifts, maybe not quite as dramatic as some have appeared. But I think this sense of the inadequacy of existing strategy had begun to build, and on both sides of the political spectrum. So what's going to happen? Well, fortunately, I'm out of time, so I don't have to answer that question, but let me speculate about it just very briefly. If you consider the broad alternatives, at one end of the spectrum, you could conceivably revert to something that would more closely resemble a Cold War strategy of containment, in which the engagement part of this mixed strategy would be cut back dramatically, and in which the balancing part would be increased dramatically. I don't think that's likely. It could happen. If it happens, it'll be the result, I think, of miscalculation and escalation that probably neither side intends. I don't see it as something that the United States is going to choose deliberately. The costs are obvious, the risks as well, and there's a lack of support both in the United States and even more so, I would say, among US allies in the region. So I don't think that's likely to happen, or it's certainly not going to happen soon. But if you go to the other end of the spectrum and imagine some kind of accommodation or grand bargain in which the United States and China would somehow reach agreement, perhaps on spheres of influence, it seems to me at this point there is no mutually acceptable deal that seems even remotely plausible. I don't think the United States is going to willingly abandon its allies or its security commitments, including to Taiwan. I don't think the United States is going to back away from its commitment to maintaining freedom of navigation. This is a principle that the United States has gone to war over repeatedly since the country's founding. And I do think there's going to be resistance to the idea of allowing a potentially hostile power to dominate Eastern Eurasia. And that, too, has been a principle of American strategy going back at least 100 years. So if either of those extremes is unlikely, at least for the moment, I think what that leaves is some continuation of a mixed strategy, albeit one in which there are significant adjustments made to both elements. On the one hand, increased efforts to maintain a favorable balance of power. That's going to require increased defense spending, the deployment of more US forces to the region, the development of strategies and concepts of operation for offsetting China's advances, particularly in so-called anti-access area denial capabilities. In addition, efforts to strengthen cooperation between the United States and its allies and strategic partners in the region, again, in order to maintain this favorable balance. And I think some of what's been going on for the last 18 months or so answers to that description. I think when you strip away some of the loose talk and the rhetoric, what the current administration has actually been doing, at least in part, is consistent with that part of the future strategy, increased balancing. The other part, and I think this is the one that's going to be more difficult and more contentious, would involve recalibrating and, to a certain degree, constricting current policies of engagement and tightening up on the more or less open exchange that's gone on between China and not only the United States, but other Western countries. And you begin to see some evidence of that, not at the moment principally in the United States on at least one score. In Australia, the debate over and crackdown on Chinese political warfare or influence operations. I think in the United States we're at the very early stages of the discussion about that problem. And finally, and perhaps most important, some effort to respond to what are increasingly perceived as China's harmful and mercantilist economic policies. The growing perception, again, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well, that China is violating the spirit, if not always the letter, of its commitments under various international accords, including the WTO, not playing by the rules or taking advantage of the rules, and that something needs to be done to defend against that process of exploitation, cutting down or restricting foreign direct investment, and perhaps pursuing other policies that might restrict China's access to the markets of the advanced industrial economies. I think that's where we may be going, although that part is yet to be written.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Godement.
Thank you. Thank you, Jae-Ho, and thank you, Asan, for having me speak again here. I'm going to follow on the previous two speakers, have my own attempt at trying to see what paradigm could best define US-China relations in the long term. I have three candidates and names. One was the notion that it's cyclical, that it occasionally deviates from median path, but always goes back to the median path. That was Mike Lampton, I think, who most famously expressed that theory. And that's very close to discussion we've been having on US politics this morning by saying, you know, it's what's happening right now, something that's accidental and will self-correct, or is it part of a longer-term tendency? That trend, by the way, was optimistic, so long as there was indeed a belief in convergence, even if the convergence took a long time to achieve, and it was part of US policy more so than for any other nation to favor that convergence. You can question whether the premise is still there or not. You would really have to believe in the long term right now to see that convergence coming back. The other theory is one I was inclined to attribute to Aaron Friedberg, who's sitting on my right. He hasn't expressed it quite in the same blunt way that I once read him, but it comes down to it. It's the notion that there is an epochal change, and in fact that there is a risk that the relationship will be in a free fall with the occasional pause on the way to a fall, and for very deep competitive reasons, and because the convergence, and he's explained it just now, isn't happening at all. And there is a contrarian thesis that lied in just one famous op-ed by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the G2 world, which is taken seriously by mostly people outside America and China. Interestingly, Europeans wrote a lot about it and were afraid, in fact, that this would turn out to be a duopoly on international relations. That's when there was still a view of the relationship pretty much on track. And we heard from Indonesia Ambassador Djalal expressing a variation of it. These are basically theories originated in America. In China, there is no paradigm for the relationship. There is a descriptory term. By the way, it's not a strategic relationship. The really important strategic relationship is with Russia. That's the first. But it's just the most important relationship, period, a statement of fact without any idea or policy directly underlying that fact. And I would very much subscribe and elaborate on the view that Aaron just gave, that the essential debate in China is about American decline. And I would modify a little what Aaron has said by saying there are moments when the needle seems to be shifting for the Chinese to fast decline or structural decline, and other moments when it's just slow or perhaps relative decline, because after all, China is rising. But that does mean that China thinks now that time is on its side one way or another, with more cautiousness or less consciousness. If we look at allies, partners, whether Europeans or Americans, I think presently the most expressed fear, which is not only about the US-China relationship, incidentally, but which is about the US more broadly, is are we going to witness what we Europeans would call an withdrawal east of Suez moment? And we have to remember that Suez was actually a crisis where the Europeans acted rather brashly and with a will, and then had to withdraw, one could almost say forever, from the strategic position they had held. And I find this, for example, is a key driver in Japanese policy towards the US, including under the Trump administration, to stick so close to the Trump administration that in turn the Trump administration has to stick very close to Japan. It's a kind of reinsurance bargain. Everywhere and including when the US is actually acting, including in Syria these past few days, there is always a notion that behind the action may lie actually a withdrawal. So that is quite important. There is a huge asymmetry. There's always been a huge political asymmetry, but it's getting bigger again. Any democracy is transparent or more transparent than other systems, but today you could live in the Alps, and if you were connected to internet, you'd still know real time who thinks what inside the White House on a number of topics, including on China. The extreme debate and personalization within power means that in theory, at least, it should be readable to any partner or adversary of the US. The same, of course, is not true in the other direction. The system in China has both personalized in a way we understand it all, if it's a personal leadership, but it's also become more opaque than ever, and it's therefore very hard to grasp what in a Chinese action is long-term, short-term, opportunistic, strategic, you know. And there is also, I would add, that Chinese tendency when something really hurts in a relationship or in foreign policy generally, do not cry ouch, which makes it even more difficult to discern what's important and what is not. I would take just an example. The TMD, the Theater Missile Defense, has been around, including with Japan and Korea, for more than a decade. And China has usually avoided the topic very successfully, never has seemed to take it into account at the level of statements anyway. Suddenly the THAAD issue comes around in South Korea. It's a concrete issue, but it's much smaller, and that creates a crisis out of proportion. One could also think that today we're seeing another type of behavior by China around what is shaping up, the two summits, the one that will happen Friday, but even more the Kim-Trump summit, with the show of force that's suddenly happening in the Taiwan Straits, with the pretty aggressive behavior towards ships transiting in the South China Sea, with what's happening with the Senkaku just today, a kind of show that China is there all across the board, not only in Korea. If China was trying to sort of help the summits and nudge North Korea perhaps one step further, it wouldn't be lighting up a small but real fire separate from that issue with the US, because North Korea understands messages very well, and when it sees that there are conflicts elsewhere, now that's the time to make a little less concessions, because you're a little more secure that harm is not going to come your way. China is actually doing otherwise. My theory about it is that it is doing it because it feels sidelined and because it has to show to all that it will exist strategically, that it will be a factor regardless of what happens at the summit. So you have this margin of interpretation, this problem for China to position itself at the center of the scale. I, by the way, think that a lot of descriptions today still exaggerate a little China's direct influence. It has indeed the power to say no. It has gained a sphere of influence in the immediate neighborhood. Things beyond a little more sketchy. And as somebody who's been doing policy in Europe, including on China, you know, looking at policy, analyzing policy, sometimes advising policy, I noticed that for Europeans, China is still the most important topic after another one that happens to be more urgent at any moment. I would venture that today our transatlantic relation, for the best or for the worst, is still more important than the relationship with China.
1 minute.
Yes. Conclusion, quite jumping over a number of things. In fact, we are in for a defensive period from the United States point of view on China. The missionary hopes are over. The issues used to be, is China going to become more like us? I think the issues on a number of fronts, and it has to do with the topic of a liberal world order, is are we going to become more like them because we have to defend ourselves on a number of grounds, or because we have to compete? There may be too much belief in the Chinese way of doing things, especially in the economy. Any jury can stay out for any number of years, but one thing is sure is that for the time being it's not doing bad, and that also influences debates in the West and in democracies. The European issue around that is to find a way that preserves the world of rules, that preserves a multilateral order. It's pretty difficult to be multilateralist if you are the only one around. So I was happy this morning at least to hear about South Korea and Japan. Obviously we need a little more than that, and we need a robust dialogue, granting that there are areas where indeed the US and the EU have a lot in common about China, but there has to be adherence to rules, and if the rules are not satisfactory, adherence to the process of changing rules rather than breaking the table on which the rules are written. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Professor White, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung. Thanks to the Asan Institute. It's a great pleasure to be here and appear on this panel. Our conversation so far today on the challenge to the liberal international order is focused a lot on what's happened internally in a lot of Western countries, and that's absolutely right. But we need to remember there's a very important broader context to the challenges we see, and that is a truly massive historic shift in the distribution of wealth and power around the world from the West to the rest. And I do think we don't understand what's happening to the global order or the regional order in Asia unless we pay very careful attention to what that shift in the distribution of wealth and power means. Because at the risk of oversimplifying some very complex international relations theory, when power shifts, orders change. And the order globally and the order in Asia is changing more than anything else because power is shifting. And what that means is the geopolitical underpinnings of the liberal order as we've known it in Asia for so many decades, and from which we've all benefited from so much, is under immense pressure. Now, to me, one of the most interesting things about this is that this has only recently been recognised. The significance of the challenge to the regional order from Asia from the shift in the distribution of wealth and power has only recently started to be recognised in its full splendour in Washington. When the National Security Strategy came out earlier this year and identified China as a fundamental strategic rival, this looked like news in Washington. It shouldn't have been. This has been going on for a long time. When old friends like Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner write in Foreign Affairs, as they did earlier this year, that, oh gosh, we got China wrong. Well, it took them a while to wake up. It seems to me that the fundamental driver of the US-China relationship for a long time has been the way in which China's growing power relative to the United States has changed China's approach to that relationship and has bred within China a determination to replace the United States as the primary power in Asia, and therefore to fundamentally change the foundation of the Asian order. And that, of course, has very big implications for us in this region. But it's one thing to recognise that. It's another thing to work out what to do about it. And nothing in the National Security Strategy, and nothing that Kurt and Eli had to say, or anybody else I think so far has had to say, has given us a very clear idea of what to do. The working assumption, the natural way to respond, is to push back. We love the old order. Why shouldn't we do what we can to preserve it? But the question that's got to be asked next is, well, what's that going to cost, and how are we going to do it? And it does seem to me that despite the new recognition in Washington of the scale and significance of the challenge, there is still a very significant underestimate of how hard it is going to be to push back and restore the geopolitical foundations, the US primacy, which has been the geopolitical foundation of the liberal order in Asia, how hard that is going to be to push back against the China that we face today, because we still underestimate China's power and its resolve. We underestimate the scale and success of China's economy and how deeply embedded not just in the agenda of the Chinese leadership in Zhongnanhai, but I would say, so far as one can judge such things, in the visceral feelings of a very large proportion of the Chinese population, that restoring, as the Chinese would see it, China's traditional place as the leading power in East Asia is a fundamental part of what they want to achieve. Now, the idea that we can somehow, at low cost, at low risk, persuade the Chinese to back off, that we can restore the US leadership as the foundation for the Asian order, presupposes that the Chinese are not really serious about this, presupposes that the Chinese are somehow less committed to changing the order in Asia than we are to preserving it. And I would simply say there is no evidence of that. There is no evidence of that at all. In fact, all the evidence points the other way. We can hope that might happen, but hope is not a policy, and it's not credible to expect that that's going to work. So if the United States is serious about pushing back and restoring the US leadership, which has been the foundation of the liberal order in Asia, it's going to have to push very hard. And remember that America itself cannot decide what that contest is going to look like. The enemy has a vote, as they say in Staff College. China will also decide how hard we have to push to persuade the Chinese to back off. And it does seem to me that what we're seeing here, and this is really, I think, the underlying point of the whole Thucydides trap argument, is a classic piece of power politics for the biggest stake that international politics has. The stake about what role major powers have in the international system. This is what states do go to war over. Now, I'm not saying that war is inevitable. It certainly ain't. But the possibility of war, the risk of war, the manipulation of that risk, this is all very Thomas Schelling, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War. That is central to the way this will play out. And unless the United States can persuade China that it is so serious about preserving its leadership role in Asia, that it convinced the Chinese that they will have to fight a serious war with the United States in order to prevail, unless the United States can convince China that it is willing to fight a major war, perhaps a nuclear war, to preserve its leadership in Asia, then I think we should be very pessimistic about America's chances of preserving that position. This is much more like the Cold War, in other words, than we'd like to think it is. Now, the big question then is the United States up for this? Is the United States sufficiently committed to preserving its leadership in Asia to be prepared and to be able to persuade China that it's prepared to go to the mat in order to preserve its position? In other words, can it persuade China that it is more serious about preserving its leadership in Asia than the United States, than China is about replacing it? And you can't answer that question by talking about the past. You can't say America's committed to remaining the leading power in Asia because it has been for so long. Because that was then, this is now. And what's different about now is China's power. The United States has never faced a country as powerful as China is today in Asia. In fact, on some measures, some really important measures, the United States has never faced a country as powerful as China is today. Full stop. Because no country that America has ever confronted since it became a global power itself in the late 19th century or early 20th century has had an economy nearly as big as America's, as China's is today in relation to America. And that's all true before Trump. Now the task is for an America which elected Donald Trump, and which, this brings us back to the populism point, and in which the politics of America's international role, the politics of America's commitment to its global role, are subject to all the pressures that were so well described in the session this morning and in a very interesting session we had just before on US populism. All of those pressures come to pass. What argument can America make to say that it is so determined to preserve its leadership in Asia that it will face China down? Well, don't talk about the open door. The open door worked very well as an argument for a century, but that doesn't seem to have a lot of appeal in America at the moment. So I do think it's not just very hard to see Donald Trump persuading Americans and therefore persuading the Chinese and therefore persuading the rest of us, I might say, that America's resolve is strong enough to win this contest with China. It's any other credible political leader. It's whoever gets elected when Donald Trump's out of the White House. So I think there's a really harsh reality here. The reality is that the distribution of wealth and power in Asia has changed really fundamentally, and it's not going back. China's not going to disappear. China is going to be the world's biggest economy. And its chances of changing politically, internally, in a way that, even if the Communist Party loses office, in a way that compels it to retreat from its desire to be the leading regional power, well, I think we'd have to be very optimistic to think that can happen. So this is really important to us. It means the old order, based on US primacy, will not last. In fact, you can make the point it's already gone. So what our conversation should be about is not how can we rebuild that order, is what contribution can we make to building the new order which will emerge in Asia as a result of the new distribution of wealth and power, in which China will play a bigger role. What can we do to help shape that order, to prevent it becoming too illiberal, to manage down the illiberality of the illiberal new international order which is emerging in Asia? Because if we don't do that, China will just have it all its own way. The more we focus back on trying to recreate the old order, the less influence we'll have on shaping the new one, and the more China will have. A very wise Frenchman who'd spent decades trying to manage the decline of that particular part of the European colonial empires in the 50s and 60s and 70s once said to me, "We must manage the revolutions we cannot avoid." We cannot avoid a revolution in the strategic order in Asia, and the challenge is to try and manage it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador Wolfowitz?
Thank you, and thank, is it working, mic working?
Yes.
And thank you, Asan, for this topic. I think it's a very good definition of the world that we're facing today, and forgive me if I might just begin. I agree with Hugh White that we shouldn't look too much to the past, but as an old-timer, I can't resist a couple of war stories. My former military friends used to say, be careful about telling war stories when there are eyewitnesses present. But this goes back far enough that I think there are very few eyewitnesses possibly in this room. I remember coming to Korea in 1983 with President Reagan, and the Chundu-won regime, with their fine, delicate sense of public relations, decided that the way to keep human rights out of the visit would be to put all the dissidents under house arrest so they couldn't talk to the press. Well, of course, that was the only subject of the visit. And I got thrown like the Christian to the lions, fortunately anonymously, to brief the traveling White House press corps. And I was asked, well, what is the human rights? Does the Reagan administration have a human rights policy? And I said, well, actually, the president's focus of this visit is to get President Chung to pledge not just to his own people, which doesn't mean so much, but to the President of the United States that he will honor the commitment to step down after one term, the constitutional limitation to step down after one term in power. And I remember reading an editorial in the Washington Post the next day, attacking, fortunately not me by name, but the anonymous administration spokesman for this poor excuse for a human rights policy. That was '83. 4 years later, Chung was forced to accede to direct elections of the president. 10 years after that, Kim Dae-jung, whose life actually had been saved, and this is something that I didn't know at the time, so I couldn't even talk about it, whose life was saved in 1980 during the transition to Carter by an intervention by Dick Allen, who was Reagan's national security advisor designate, warning Chundu-won not to execute Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung in '87 was elected president of this country. So an awful lot did change. I wish I could have said, as President Trump seems to like to say, just watch and see. But if you watched and saw, a lot did change. And I think that experience of the 1980s, not just with Korea, not just with the Philippines, not just with Taiwan, dramatically with the Soviet Union, but even with South Africa, which I never thought would end apartheid in my lifetime, or Indonesia, which went through its own amazing democratic revolution in 1998. I think probably inspired a sort of excessive degree of optimism about the appeal of democratic values and liberal values. And I think that is definitely under challenge today. I do think that we should be a little bit careful, just as the experience of '83 of having the #2 in the U.S. Embassy tell George Shultz, Korea's never had a democracy in its history and they don't really care about it. I think we should be careful similarly about making that kind of assumption about China today. Yes, Xi Jinping has acquired more power than any previous leader since Mao Zedong, probably including Deng Xiaoping. but I'm not so sure that all Chinese are all that happy about it. And I do think a very important part of competing with China is to try to demonstrate, as we're not doing a very good job of today, that the democratic alternative, that the democracies of the United States and Asia and Europe are actually successful societies in which people would much prefer to live than in China. To go back a little bit less far in the past, I remember in '89, after the Berlin Wall came down, Secretary of Defense Cheney directed that we develop a new defense strategy because we couldn't defend Cold War budgets any longer. And what we learned, myself, I was then the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Colin Powell was the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Together we developed something that was called a regional defense strategy, which said, look, if you stop focusing on the Soviet Union as a global power, which puts exceptional strain on your defense requirements, and instead look at preventing a hostile country from gaining dominance over one of the three regions that could itself generate the power to become a new superpower, that's a different kind of strategy that is less demanding. Well, fast forward to the present, and what we find, in fact, is in each of those three regions, namely Europe, East Asia, and what we identified as the Persian Gulf, which was not something that had been in the Defense Department planning up to that time, but suddenly broke on the scene with Saddam's invasion of Kuwait right about the time we announced the strategy. We see, I would say, hostile countries attempting to achieve dominance in each of those three regions. And while each of these three aspiring regional hegemons are quite different from one another, and I would argue that China in some ways is a more formidable challenge, even though perhaps precisely because it's less overtly military and depends heavily on its economic influence. Nonetheless, those three challenges do have some common features, and I would like to focus on two in particular today. First of all three of those the leaders of all three of those countries today define their strategic goals in terms that frankly recall an imperial past. For Xi Jinping, of course, it's the Ming Dynasty. For Vladimir Putin, it's not just the empire of the czars, but of the Soviet Union. And for the theocratic rulers of Iran, in addition to their appeal to Islam, they define their goals very much in reference to the pre-Islamic empire. In fact, an Iranian leader not so long ago, in a moment of frankness, said this is about the glory of the Persian Empire. And he said everything improves when it comes to Persia, even Islam. I guess that's a reference to the Shia version of Islam. For each of these would-be imperial restorations, the principal obstacle to their ambitions are US-led coalitions. And let me underline, and I can't say it often enough in a brief intervention, that word coalitions, because I do think that the reason the US in the end was successful in the Cold War was not just because we were, at the end of the day, perhaps a stronger superpower than the Soviet Union, but because countries wanted to be our allies, unlike the Soviet Union. And in some ways, as a sole superpower, you're actually weaker than as one of two, because when you're one of two, people begin to decide, well, maybe I don't want to be too close to the other one because it's a bully. I'm thinking now of China. And it's true that China has some appeals, economic appeals, that the United States doesn't have, but when Chinese can go to Singapore and say, we're the big guy, you're the little guy, I think for all of Trump's bullying rhetoric, the United States' actions are not in the same category. I think in the long run, that's a huge advantage. But a second feature that's common to all three of these regional rivals is their internal domestic structures are already imperial. China's claim to rule over Tibet and over Xinjiang is frankly an imperial claim. Similarly, there are large minorities of Arabs, Baluchis, and particularly Azerbaijanis in Iran. I'm not sure even that Persians represent the largest single ethnic group, or probably the largest single one, but not necessarily even a majority. And of course, Putin rules Russia in part by his ruthless suppression of ethnic minorities like the Chechens. None of these three aspiring empires possess the legitimacy that comes from the free decision of free people. So in fact, in part, reaching back to reclaim the glory of ancient empires is for each of them, I think, a partial way to acquire popular legitimacy. Certainly that's true, I think, in China. So for each of them, not only is the US an obstacle to regional ambitions, but liberal democracy is a challenge to their domestic legitimacy. And so it's very much in their interests to do what they can to discredit liberal democracy. in Putin's remarkably successful effort to create fundamental doubts in the United States about the success of democracy, and not only in the US, but in some countries of Europe as well, we certainly see an advanced version of that. I think more subtle versions are going to be emulated. China's going to emulate Putin's success in more subtle ways, and in fact, I think is already doing so both in the United States and Australia and probably elsewhere. And even though none of these countries yet presents the kind of global ideological global challenge that the former Soviet Union did during the Cold War, and it's certainly not an ideological challenge in the way the Soviets were, their common interests could lead them, I think, to come together in an effort to force the US out of playing a dominant role in key regions of the world. And one place where I'd like to focus briefly this afternoon, where I think that could be of major importance, is the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly in the Persian Gulf. The shale revolution has brought the United States into an era of energy independence, but I think too often it is assumed that therefore those energy resources in the Gulf no longer matter to us. The fact is, we may be independent of the energy resources, but we're not independent of the world economy, which would in fact collapse if there were major disruption in the Gulf to energy supplies. And of course, for China and Japan and Korea, the dependence on energy from the Persian Gulf is particularly clear.
Ambassador, you have 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. In fact, you can find Chinese documents where they emphasize that China's biggest vulnerability are the sea lanes from, they don't say specifically the Persian Gulf, but the sea lanes to China from the sources of its energy. It's certainly understandable. It's understandable to me, having made my own shift in the 1980s from focusing on the Middle East as head of policy planning to focusing on East Asia, which was a great relief. It was like going from a part of the world that only creates problems to a part of the world where people only solve problems. So it's understandable for many reasons why Americans would like to forget about the Middle East. But I think it's very much in the same vein that Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You may not be interested in the energy resources of the Middle East, but they are interested in you. And I think if you look at the maps of the One Belt, One Road, you will see that especially the One Belt very much encircles those resources. So I think I might not be as articulate or as convinced as Ed Fulner was about, there are good things to be said about the Trump administration. Let me say this, I think the National Security Strategy is a useful document. They rarely are. This one is more useful than most. I think introducing the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific is a much better way to talk about our objectives in that part of the world than talking about America first. I guess I would agree with Dino with respect to the rhetoric. But I think that is a useful expression. I also believe that Trump did something important when he made his first foreign visit, not to Europe and not to Asia, but to the Middle East, and went to Saudi Arabia and gave with a very nice tone, not a lecturing tone, but basically said to the Muslim leaders that were there from 50 countries, it's your responsibility to face up to the extremists in your midst. We will help you, but you've got to get rid of them, basically. And we understand you have a real threat from Iran, and we are there to help and support you with that. I think that corrects what I believe were two strategic errors of the Obama administration. And I'm not trying to be partisan here, but I think the pivot to Asia, which meant pivot away from the Persian Gulf, was a mistake. And certainly the idea that Obama advanced in at least one interview that Saudi Arabia needs to get used to sharing the Persian Gulf with Iran is a remarkable and wrong statement coming from an American president. We should be interested in helping the Persian Gulf be an area that remains one of American dominance, and I think it's possible to do that, particularly if we look to allies, not only allies in the Muslim world, but also to what the administration, I think, has been emphasizing with the democracies of East Asia, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, like the Quad powers that they're talking about. I think the key to a successful, I could not agree more with Hugh White's comment that hope is not a strategy, and that, by the way, Aaron Friedberg could have said it, we didn't all get it wrong. A lot of people saw this coming, but I think you're absolutely right that people still underestimate the difficulty of confronting this. On the other hand, I think people still underestimate or exaggerate the strength of China as opposed to the combined strength of just India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, not to mention Indonesia and a few other countries you could throw into that mix. If China is, and that's why they so much don't want to see us talk about anything that they could characterize as containment, don't want to see us getting together to compete with them or to confront them.
Thank you.
I think any successful strategy has to take that as an assumption and work with it. Thank you.
I would like to pose a few questions to each of the speakers. First to Professor Friedberg. I talked about the peaceful power transition from the UK to US a long time ago. It took place even without the constraint of nuclear competition. Then what kind of implication do we have for US-China relations?
Well, I think the differences there in many ways were more striking than the similarities. And among the important differences were the sense of commonality between the US and Britain, based in part in the sense that they both derived from the same civilization, and also increasingly from the belief that they had similar political institutions. I think that probably was the most important factor in allowing the British to feel comfortable in pulling back from the Western Hemisphere to concentrate on Europe. And it seems to me the ideological factor and the divergence between the United States and China on questions of values and belief is of fundamental importance. I don't think the United States would be, or people in the United States would be as concerned about the implications of the growth of Chinese power if China were a liberal democracy.
Okay. That brings me to Professor White. In one of your books, published a couple of years ago, you mentioned about the need for power sharing between the US and China. And if that concept is similar to what I understand as a shared hegemony or bigemony, then we already have a precedent, that is the US-Soviet bigemony during the Cold War. But that bigemony was established along the ideological lines. But power sharing of yours, that is established along the lines of what?
Well, it's a good question. My starting point that got me to that analysis was to say, really, there are just three options for how the US and China can get along. One is that their rivalry can escalate, and that's very dangerous, and we can't be sure the United States would win it. Another is that the US can withdraw from Asia and leave it to China. And the third is they do some sort of deal whereby the United States maintains a strong role in Asia, not as strong as it was, not dominance, but a strong role in Asia, which has to be done in some kind of negotiation with China. And I can see lots of problems with that and lots of reasons to be anxious about it. As you say, it has elements of a dual hegemony. But question, though, in our business is not do we like it better than the alternatives? And if the alternative is for the United States to withdraw from Asia and leave us to deal with China by ourselves, or for the United States to confront China in an escalating rivalry in which the United States' objective is to try and compel China to accept American leadership, which I think is very unlikely to succeed and is very likely to produce a conflict, then I think the power sharing option is the least bad option. But you're right, how does it look? How does it work in practice? I don't know. There are models in history at which the concert of Europe in the 19th century is perhaps the best, and it's worth bearing in mind that what was distinctive about the concert of Europe is not just that the various major powers in Europe balanced one another, it's that they agreed to manage their competition within a fairly clear framework and to avoid it getting too bitter. And if you envisaged a concert of Asia in which the US and China and perhaps other great powers like India and Japan could agree to manage down their rivalry, then Asia's future could look reasonably good. Complex, uncertain, hard to envisage, yes, but better than the alternatives, you bet. Now I think the risk is that option has more or less disappeared. I think the chances of the US and China managing to negotiate that kind of deal is much lower now than it was 5 years ago when I published that book. And the likelihood that either we see escalating rivalry between the US and China or the US withdrawing from Asia are much higher. I now personally think that because of the years we've lost and because of the way politics is evolving in the United States and because of China's growing strength and ambition and confidence, the likelihood that we end up with a US withdrawal from Asia, leaving those of us on the panel who live on this side of the Pacific to deal with China by ourselves, is much higher than it was before. I used to think that was the least likely outcome. I now fear that it's the least unlikely outcome.
Okay. My question for Professor Godement would be, recently ambassadors of the all EU member states in China, except for Hungary, made a statement critical of Belt and Road Initiative. Is that, I mean, can I take that as a sort of mainstream view of EU about the Belt and Road Initiative?
There is a growing mainstream view, but unfortunately that particular piece of information is a bit of a stretch by the news agency I've checked. It's actually an internal report from the ambassadors to Beijing, not yet, as it was written, a communication to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was very surprised when I saw it as a letter. The fact it was 27 and 20 out of 28, and Hungary was the only outlier, almost made it stronger, actually. But it's not yet that. However, yes, on a number of issues, Europe is coming together. I mean, in this part of the world, you still hear a lot about fragmentation, you hear a lot of populism, you hear a lot about divides and cracks within the EU. Actually, on this kind of topic, for a number of realist reasons, that's not happening. The EU has been acting more consistently, not in complete unity, not always, and you know, we have topics on which we have unanimity voting, which makes it much harder, by the way. Then we look a little more like ASEAN, by the way, and other topics on which we don't need unanimity voting. But on the nuts and bolts, or the bread and butter issues of technology, IP theft, imbalance, the need for reciprocity, there is a lot of closeness with current US views, hurt by unilateral action, as I explained very quickly in my statement. On strategies of influence, there is a growing realization about what's going on. And on the Belt and Road, we may have a debate on that. I belong to the camp of those who think, yes, there is a lot of money being spent by China. Yes, it's the #1 propaganda theme, but it's not as big as it looks, and especially for the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which are most targeted, it's been a letdown more than expansion of Chinese influence.
My question for Ambassador Djalal is that you mentioned in your presentation that China is making efforts to influence domestic politics in Indonesia and elsewhere. I think that brings me to a question to the Professor White as well, because resignation of Senator Sam Destiari last July, that is a very important example of that. So how is that really happening in Indonesia? How is China really making efforts to do so?
Well, let me be clear on this, because this is a sensitive point. I said that China Communist Party establishing relations with political parties in Indonesia and other countries, and in fact, in contrast, I'm a bit surprised that the Republicans and Democrats are not making the same efforts. But I think China has been very cautious about not intervening in Indonesia's domestic politics. In fact, when I was in China, one Chinese official told me in confidence, said that China learned a lesson from 1965 during the attempted coup, because that led to frozen relations for so many years. And violence and bloodbath in Indonesia. So China, I think, in my view, is very careful not to be seen about exporting ideology, the communist ideology, and this was made clear by President Xi Jinping in his 19th Party Congress address. And I think they're going to be very careful about any appearance of intervening in Indonesia's domestic affairs, or I think any other Southeast Asian countries as well. Yeah.
My question to Ambassador Wolfowitz, the most recent Bloomberg prediction is that the GDP of China will surpass that of the US by 2028. And many people say the military parity between the US and China will be achieved, or near parity will be achieved toward the late 2030s. Okay? How do you see the process of hegemonic competition will unfold after that? Once military parity and economic parity is achieved. What next?
First of all, I think any of those predictions have to be taken with several pounds of salt, and they depend on more than just calculations about dollars of GDP. I'm not saying that it's going to be better it could even be worse. And I think one of the areas that is most troubling, most concerning to me, is the whole area of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Not to say that they're the same thing, they're actually very different, but they both involve high levels of technological innovation, where the Chinese seem to be very determined to push ahead, particularly with military applications. And I'd also make the point that being the first with an innovation doesn't necessarily make you the most successful at applying it. It wasn't the Germans who invented tanks, it was the French and the British. In fact, the French and the British were the first to deploy tanks in combat. But the Germans were the first to figure out how to make them a decisive instrument of warfare. And in that respect, I worry a lot that Hugh White's comment about resolve and determination may favor the Chinese side, even if they don't get to the innovations first. So, look, a lot depends. You asked how does it all play out. I think a lot depends on how the rest of the world, and it's not just the United States, it's very much Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Australia, how they see the consequences to them of failing to confront China. Because the consequences of confronting China, at some point in terms of military confrontation, as Professor White said, are potentially enormous. And in the Cold War, we were prepared to confront them basically over Berlin, even at the risk of what could have been a catastrophic war. I don't know whether that kind of resolve is there, and I don't think anyone can predict it. I think it partly depends on how China behaves and what China is demanding, and whether there's any degree of, let's use that term, power sharing, since we've been using it just now, degree of power sharing that the rest of the world can live with. But to say, look, we're fine dividing the Pacific just down the middle, you can have the eastern half, I don't think that one works.
Thank you. I would like to use the remaining 5 minutes for Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Let me first collect 3-4 questions and then let the panelists answer. Please.
Thank you very much for wonderful presentations. My name is Yamaguchi from Japan, International University of Japan. My question goes to the Professor Friedberg, and you talked about strategic balance between US and China. When you talked about that, you touched upon US alliances with other countries. My question is that China is rising and will rise, and the US is not rising. We are reason. US partners and allies are not rising as China rises. But we are reason. In the future, you talked about US efforts to make the balance right. How do you see the sharing of roles, responsibility, burden among US and its allies?
Joseph.
Thank you. Joseph Liao from Singapore. I was very intrigued because Hugh, you cautioned about the dangers of looking at history, right? But then right after you, Paul, you talked about how all the three revisionists or presumed revisionist powers are doing precisely that, looking into their own histories and trying to rebuild their visions of empire. But my question is really for Hugh. So you talked about leadership, but the thing about leadership is you kind of got to have followers, right? Or else you're not really leading. And so there's always this debate about to what extent China can or already has, encouraged a following. And I ask this because, yes, they're throwing a lot of money at the region, and the regional states are working with them. But it reminded me, the other day I was watching a YouTube video of Mahathir Mohamad, right? So he's back again. just a short campaign thing. He was telling his followers that if UMNO gives you money, take it, right? Doesn't mean you have to vote for them.
Anyone else? Question? Okay. Who wants to go first? Professor Friedberg or Professor White?
Whichever you prefer.
You go first, yeah.
To General Yamaguchi's question, and this goes back to something that Ambassador Wolfowitz said. I think there are many opportunities for cooperation among the United States, its allies, and then some strategic partners who are not necessarily allies. And some of that is already well underway. I mean, in addition to the traditional bilateral alliances, you have these new 3- and 4-sided cooperative arrangements, the Quad being the most notable one. And that, it seems to me, is all to the good. That's, I think, a natural response on the part of those in the region who are concerned about the implications of China's rising power. From a military perspective, it seems to me the first step is to encourage and enable, from the point of view of the United States, friends and allies to do what they need to do to defend themselves, their own interests, their airspace, the waters that surround their territory. And there's a good deal that we could do to help our partners in that regard that would create significant military challenges for China.
Professor White?
Yeah, look, really good question. And I think it goes to the point that, this point about how much should we rely on history. We have a model of what leadership in Asia looks like, and it's a model which is deeply based on the experience of the last 40 or 50 years. And one of the things that's most distinctive about that experience is that US leadership in Asia was not just uncontested by any great power, it was actually welcomed by everyone in the region. This is actually very unusual in history, that you have a globally, originally dominant power, a hegemon, that is not just not opposed, but people say, yeah, we like that. Now, people have been, there's been variations in warmth, but actually across the board, most countries have welcomed it, certainly Singapore, certainly Australia, but South Korea, of course, and so on. But we need to be aware of the idea that that's the only model of regional leadership you can have. And I think one of the reasons why I think people have been insufficiently conscious of how China's power and influence has grown is they keep on saying, China doesn't look like the United States, therefore it can't be acquiring a leadership role. But you can lead by punishment. It's not pretty, but you can do it. And the essence of China's leadership model is, well, there's a big carrot there, and that is the fact that all of us in Asia, I think, do basically regard China as a principal source of future economic opportunities for us, and that's terribly important. But there's also the stick, that is, they can impose big costs on us. And so, the Australian government passes laws a few months ago aimed very obviously at what was alleged to be Chinese government interference in Australian political practices, and the Chinese government have stopped Australian ministerial visits, and that puts huge political pressure on Australian government. And as a result, the Australian government says, when the US national security strategy came out, the Australian government said they didn't agree with its characterisation of China, though of course they do. So that's, it's not pretty, but it's leadership. It's them telling us what to do and us saying, okay. And that's the future. That's why we better be pretty careful how we manage it.
Thank you very much. Our time
is... Yeah, Finlandisation. That's right, welcome.
Our time is up, so please join me thanking the panelists.